Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and House of the Dragons, the prequel to Game of Thrones, has been released, and honestly it was much better than I was expecting. I've done a full review on Night's Watch on the actual content of the episode, the story, characters and things, but here I want to have a look at how accurate the medieval elements in this episode are. Now, people might be wondering, why are you looking at accuracy? This is a fantasy. It's very clear that House of the Dragons and Game of Thrones in general is very much inspired and based on medieval culture. And on top of that, George R.R. Martin has taken direct inspiration from the medieval period for many elements in it. This is a very medieval-themed show. In actual fact, they have done some really impressive things with how accurate these medieval elements are, and so I want to compliment where they do things really well, but also call out things which are clearly not accurate to the medieval period, because this is the other thing why I like doing this. Is people's exposure to medieval culture and stuff often comes from fantasy, and they might actually erroneously assume certain elements that are in this show, because it's medieval themed, are accurate to the medieval period, and so I like to point out when they're not, when they are, and the ones that are, honestly, are actually done really, really well in terms of functional armor that we see and other elements, so much so, they've lifted their game. There's a lot of improvements with the depiction of medieval culture in House of the Dragon compared to Game of Thrones specifically, which increases the immersion and kind of realistic feel of this world. And so we'll start out with one of the opening scenes. We see Harrenhal. Harrenhal is one of the biggest castles in the Game of Thrones universe. The thing that, is accurate about this is we see some of the architectural elements. See these wide, large kind of archways that are happening here and how they're housed on really strong kind of pillar foundations. We also see additional archways on top of the lower archways, which one, reduces weight, but also enables for other intermediate kind of floors and access that clearly was the case before it fell into ruin. When I say fall into ruin, was destroyed by dragonfire. This is all very accurate Gothic style architecture that dates to the medieval period, and the scale also matches the descriptions of Harrenhal. It looks amazing, really impressive, but also really accurate. We see another angle of the Red Keep, and there's one thing that I've always kind of appreciated about the Red Keep is this element right here. It is the cathedral kind of attachment to the Red Keep, which I think might even be the Great Hall that we often see, the king sitting on, with the sword throne. This armor right here, we get to see some other angles of this armor throughout the episode. Look, I'm not a fan. There's some issues that I don't like. I don't like the crisscrossing nature and how it will affect kind of the integrity, because if this was made, I think you would actually need to make it out of strips, and that means trying to forge weld them together, and it just gives me the impression that these would actually be weak points with a really solid hit. There's greater chances of it might cave in. If it was made out of solid and these are actual ribs, like these indents between, adds kind of like a ribbing effect on it, that could actually increase strength. So maybe my criticism is unfounded. I just feel it does not match the pauldrons. The pauldrons we see, very kind of authentic medieval pauldrons that are smooth and have the adornment, and then a more fantasy kind of breastplate, which doesn't match the pauldrons. And so if you're going to go one or the other, I'd say go fully in one way, fantasy, or fully authentic in the other, and because it's a bit of a mismatch, it gets just me, I don't like the look as a result. It kind of gives me, I don't know, visual authentic whiplash. This carriage kind of threw me a bit because to me, it doesn't match the visual style of nearly anything else in the show. Obviously, it's not accurate. Though the braking, see how there's like this braking system right here near the wheels? The braking system seems pretty, like authentic. The spoke wheels are a bit stylized and they're a bit clunky, but that'd be functional enough. The design of the actual internal compartment of the carriage, you could justify it with it's part of the fantasy. It's not an authentic medieval design, of course. It just doesn't match a lot of the other designs in the show. And so if you're going fantasy, I would say try and get some visual consistency, which is why it's thrown me a little bit. Love her dress right here. Very simple, elegant, medieval style dress. I've seen many kind of comparisons that are very close and accurate to what this one looks like. Really good. The battlement here, see the tower? The crenellation, so the actual merlon, which is the tooth that comes up, obviously isn't high enough. We see someone's full head poking out above. It's like, if you see that head, that's what you would aim for when you're shooting, so the crenellations aren't high enough. And then we see an extension where they're extended a little bit from the line of the wall beneath, but there's no matriculations, which would allow shooting through that extension down to people on the line of the wall beneath. So there's really no point apart from a visual aesthetic. And sometimes they did add visual elements to even, battlements, fortresses and stuff. But that's what it have to be. It don't have to be a visual element, but it's a pretty flawed imperfect battlement that we see. This is a very authentic kind of scene. I actually wonder if they used a real Spanish kind of, town that has old origins, maybe even the medieval period, because it looks pretty authentic. And if it's just a made set, it's a very well made set, because it looks real. Comparing those poor battlements to these battlements, oh, I like these ones. What we see here, yes, matriculations. Matriculation, if you don't know, I have whole videos on them. It allows the defenders on the wall to shoot through this kind of, so the corbel extends the battlement out from the line of the wall beneath, and then you can shoot through that extension to people that are hugging the wall that otherwise you have to lean out all the way and expose yourself to hit them. And we like their dedicated matriculations with, it's a stylized kind of design where the merlon is sitting right on top and it's only the merlon that's extended out, but it works and I really like it. The reason why I like this scene here, we see Roman arches, and this is just, so Roman arches are rounded arches, they're not like pointed, and it could demonstrate that this might be an older architectural style, but in terms of how Roman arches are often, incorporated in architecture, this is exactly it. It's perfectly executed, really well done. Brigandine, if you look closely, there's studs on this, what looks to be a leather facing kind of outfit. So this isn't leather armor, this looks like kind of a leather facing with metal being studded onto the inside. Oh, it's Brigandine, baby. Really great to see. It's an authentic type of medieval armor, and it just makes it look more real. What we see here is actually a female designed or female version of the surcoat. What I'm wearing here is a male surcoat. It's particularly a padded surcoat. It's a combination between a gambeson and a surcoat. But in terms of cut and shape, this is a male designed surcoat, but there was a feminine designed surcoat that we see lots in medieval art, and the distinct feature is that the openings for the arms loop and hang down a bit more, and we see the maids right here wearing it. It's great to see. We see another close-up of the armor that I don't like. Now, one thing that does work is that it doesn't come all the way down. See where his belt is hanging and see where the armor ends? This is actually accurate, where a breastplate usually ends just where the hip line is, not at the waist, and that means it's easy to like bend and curve. One of the inaccurate elements that we see on poorly designed breastplates, even if they try and make it look like more medieval styled, is that the breastplate goes far too low, right to where the hips are, and they wouldn't be able to actually curve and bend too much, which would be quite restrictive and uncomfortable. Small thing, but the swords on the sword throne, right? These are actually very authentic medieval styled swords, a bit kind of on the early style with a long wide crossguard. So is this almost like a Brazil nut pummel there? But they could have made the swords inauthentic, but no, they actually picked some pretty authentic looking medieval swords to be comprised or part of the sword throne. So when it comes to royalty, I could see a royalty having a stone carved bath like that we see here, be very hard to move around, and in its position, like you're restricting most of the functionality of the room by dumping it in the middle of the room. In the medieval period, they had wooden baths, okay? Large kind of barrels, sometimes long or round and things. And even royalty, that was fine. They're just wooden ones, and they could be brought into the room with, then they would heat up kind of jugs of water, pour the bath, they could have it there, or there would be a dedicated bath room, or a bath house even. But medieval people absolutely did take baths. We have a lot of medieval art showing that, as well as sometimes certain risque things happening in association with those baths as well. So yes, they liked baths. They also liked being clean. It's a misconception that medieval people didn't bathe. So we see the town guard here, and what I want to comment on is their helmet. It's an odd design for a nasal helmet because we see these weird kind of lines, and part of it almost looks like they're visor lines, that they could be lowered and look through these slits, but there's no indication it can actually be lowered. And if that's the case, I don't see the purpose of this double kind of line that adds additional weight for a fairly standard nasal guard helmet. You just have the nasal guard, and I don't know, it seems like needless adornment for a town guard. It's a bit out of place, doesn't make it look like it's a great design. But we see the type of armor they're wearing, and this is like poorly designed brigandine that we see more in fantasy. So if you have a look at this breastplate here, we see kind of square little metal things that are riveted, and these look to be on the outside, but the way that they're made is they're just butted against each other. Sometimes, no, they even have a bit of a gap between each metal plate. With actual brigandine, those metal plates are overlapped, so there's not a gap that a sword blade could actually find and strike through. And one of the issues with the way it's done here, because there is a gap, if you even land on a plate, you would press the plate in, and there's a chance the sword will slide from that plate, from being pressed in, into a gap more naturally, and it makes it quite vulnerable. So this is actually a very poorly designed brigandine, and it's ahistorical as a result. So one, it fails on the functionality utility test, and it also fails on the authentic test, because even if it fails to be authentic to the medieval period, you at least want it to be functional, and this one has distinct flaws, errors in the functional utility of this armor, just by having a look at it. One of the things I like about this scene is the variety of colours. We see blue, red, bright blue, a different shade of blue, purple as well. There would also be green. I think there's a very dark green in there, actually. And so what I find interesting, this is fantasy. It's in the Game of Thrones universe, yet some of the depictions are more accurate than films that are based in the medieval period. There are a lot of films that are supposed to be based in our own history, and the depiction of that period is awful, where everyone is wearing greys, browns, it's all dirty and dark. But Game of Thrones fantasy actually has more realistic elements in it. Isn't that funny? And yeah, some of the outfits here as well. If we see the lady's outfit just on who's sitting on the side over there, you can tell that that's actually kind of a purple brocaded dress. Medieval people loved brocades in their outfits, but also in the decoration in their homes. They would have like these carpet wall hangings that would be these elaborate brocades. I have a whole video on that as well. But overall, the costuming in House of Dragons is brilliant, really well done. I personally love this jousting arena. This is one of the flaws in Game of Thrones, where they had the joust that looked really cheap, like some backwater noble was holding it, when this was actually held by the king himself. This is the jousting arena that a king would have, one dedicated, made for it. Now, I will actually admit, there is some architectural elements in this jousting arena that somewhat do match that weird carriage. So I guess there might be small elements of design consistency in that regard, because if you see the odd kind of curve and also the shelter for the nobility that's at the center, that is a matching kind of design visual style as the carriage. Okay, there we go. It's really big. A lot of people come and attend. It's made to, be a big spectacle. I like it. Like, this is the jousting arena a king should have. I understand that the Game of Thrones one was the way it was because of budgetary restraints. This one seems to have a larger budget, and they're doing more with it, because the general look of this show just looks better than, say, the trailers we've seen for Rings of Power, where even with all the money they've sunk into Rings of Power, there's some scenes I look at and they just look a bit cheap. But here, it actually looks good. They're doing a lot with the budget they have, and we get much better, authentic kind of scenes for a big joust that the king is holding at the capital. For the jousting itself, there's a bit to comment on, because there's some interesting elements that people might think are inaccurate to the medieval period. But this is the thing, we actually don't know perfectly what all the jousts were like in the medieval period. We have accounts and things that describe certain jousts here and there, but nothing was standardized. If there was a local lord that wanted his joust to have one different rule or to do something different, he was perfectly entitled and he would do it. And so we actually do see different accounts of different rules in jousts in different periods and different regions of the medieval period. For one, and this gets to inform us about some of the violence we see later in the joust, in the medieval period, we have an account of two types of jousts, and these aren't the only two, there are many different types, but in one general sense, there was called the joust of war and the joust of peace. The joust of war was defined by the fact that they would use sharp, deadly-tipped lances in the joust. Yes, deadly lances. And the joust of peace, they would have blunted jousting heads as part of it, and that was called the joust of peace. We can get informed in a number of things why there'd be a division. One, they didn't want people to die, and they did it because it seems like people might very likely have died in the joust of war, but also that people were willing to risk their lives and did die in jousting tournaments because there was a thing called the joust of war. And so there are times in this joust where some of the people in it just flat out seem to be murdering each other. It depends to what extreme, because we also see in this joust that the opponent needs to yield for a victor to be determined. Now, the way that you establish winning in a joust, your opponent yielding, or you fight him to a point he's incapacitated, and that can lead to lethal injury. And so even if you have someone knocked off their feet and they're not yielding, for you to be established as the winner in this context, you then need to incapacitate them, which could very well be a lethal blow. If they're going to get up and fight, you might need to end it as quickly as possible and go for the most lethal strike to ensure the winning, which can be strikes to the face. And so I've seen some people try and say that it's a bit odd that there's so much murder and death in this joust. Well, it depends on the type of context. And so if you're going to depict this element from the medieval period, you kind of get to choose which way you want to go. And for House of Dragons, it seems like they've gone with the more violent, death-likely type of joust, where death could be a very real possibility. People did die in tournaments from, hits and other things like that. If you're being generous and you want to avoid death, you would fight to just incapacitate or the opponent to yield. But if they're not yielding and you have to incapacitate them, lethal injury can be a result. So that's an interesting thing to try and consider. The joust isn't wholly inaccurate because of that. If they were wanting to take their perspective that having all their, talented knights dying in tournament is a bad thing, they could put in rules to try and prevent that, which they did do in the medieval period, but not always. That's the interesting thing. Other interesting interpretation of this joust is that there seems to be no pausing after the tilt. They race at each other, they hit, and without pausing, they grab the next lance and race at it again. Now, with the modern day jousting, they are inspired by certain accounts, and so it is accurate with the type of rule system that we use in the modern jousts, but it isn't universal. And the modern day jousting, that is, like I said, based off of actual historical precedent and texts and things, there is a pause after each tilt. A tilt is when both horses run at each other, try and knock each other off, and you get certain points. So you get a point for breaking a lance on the shield. Sometimes you can get a better point for breaking it on the helmet or something. You'll get double points if you can dehorse someone. And it's a point system, and whoever gets up to 3 points first wins that engagement. But that's just one type. There are other types of ways jousts were done in the medieval period, not point system at all until whoever just knocked the person off, and they kept going until someone was knocked off, and it wasn't about breaking lances, because sometimes they used deadly lances as well. And yeah, so different tournaments in the medieval period, and this interpretation of no pausing after a tilt. You run at each other, whatever happens, you have to grab the lance as fast as you can and run at it again. Well, this is the thing. You could try and do a tournament this way. There would be nothing restricting it because this is a fantasy setting. I haven't heard any precedent that this was one of the ways that a joust could be done in the medieval period. And if you did it this way, it would require the knights to be very on their game, very fast, and just have to adapt and learn that after that first hit, they need to get the next lance and race at it again. Makes it far more dynamic. And I think it works with the scene and episode as a result. Makes it very dynamic and quick-paced and quite engaging. Not an actual criticism. It can be justified. And so this is the other scene where we see him quickly getting the lance, but there's other things to notice. Do you see the heraldry on some of the squires and people helping out, like the guy in the corner there, but then we see another guy with heraldry. It looks like he's got a dolphin on his, and these actual look to be more authentic tabards. The dolphin one looks to be a tabard. The other one where it's got like the lion quartered tunic, it could be. Yeah, I think that's more a sleeveless tunic, but heraldry, awesome to see. Heraldry on the shields, very authentic to the medieval period. Something interesting to note, and I noted this in my review of the episode, is that there's a lip on the kind of inside-facing corner of the shield, which is a nice little element of it's like they're paying attention, because that lip would help prevent the lances sliding off and striking people in the head, also prevent shrapnel. And so, yeah, that works. And for an earlier type of jousting shield, I think it actually, it was a very immersive kind of element to add in. There are later kind of types of shields that were made specifically for jousting, which have this interesting curve. They curve kind of outways to help catch lances from deflecting off even more and prevent even more shrapnel breaking off. So, yes, shields were made specifically for the purpose of jousting and preventing shrapnel. This armor is an interesting one for me because it is both good and bad. In terms of the shape of the pauldrons and most of the shape of the breastplate, I think it works really well. But it's a close-up shot and it looks plastic. It looks pretty fake as a result. They could have airbrushed it to give it a more stronger metallic look. And you don't notice it just on casual viewing, but when you pause it, yeah, it looks a bit fake. I really like that the knights are going to the noble ladies on the stand asking for their favor, an authentic element, and we see the lip of that shield even more strongly here. I don't like the king's crown. It looks a bit plastic and fake even. It's just, I don't know, and it's also, I don't like the design. Is this subjective? What do you think? I don't know. I really like this guy's armor. It's old and battered, and so knights when they're going to tournament, even he, I think, would probably should have gone out of his way to polish his armor, make it a bit more presentable. Even the poorer ones would be able to make present. So a knight rocking up in dinted and damaged armor, I guess it could have happened. It wouldn't look nice. It's like rocking up to an important event in shabby, uncleaned clothes, okay? But just for the basic design, it's like there's some dints and stuff in it, but actually the basic shaping is pretty good. We see strong doming right at the waist. We see it at the waist at the right height, and then right with the fold. And this is why. See how high that waistline is, and where the thing that's underneath the breastplate is called the fold, and it's made out of individual lames, and those are like strips of metal that can fold and compress up, so you can ride on a horse easier, which is exactly what's happening right here. This is how armor was made in the medieval period to enable more maneuverability, but also enable riding on a horse. And even though the pauldrons are really plain, they seem to be perfectly functional. I like it. I really like his armor. I do not like this armor, all right? To me, they've gone out of their way to make it too, like, fantasy. It's too edgy as well, where it's all black and as a result doesn't necessarily look like metal. The design that they have to try and add the scales makes it look like it's sci-fi, not that it's medieval. And they've also done too many segments. See how the upper part is segmented from the lower part? You actually don't really need that on a breastplate. Sometimes there was a segment on the lower part where the upper part folded into a lower part, and then there was a strap. That's as much as they did, and that was a more authentic, interpretation. You could get away with fantasy. And look, with fantasy armor, perhaps I'm being too critical, because if it's functional, yeah, you don't see many other designs like this. Again, this could be intentional to make it stand out, more prominent. But I don't like it has no real fold. To me, the breastplate goes too far low, and that would make it a bit difficult. You can even see it kind of being pressed and pushed out while he's sitting on the horse, which gives me the impression that it's made out of plastic, not metal, where this breastplate should have ended right, underneath the rib cage, have a proper fold. That would work much better. Open-faced helm for a joust. People might say that this is to reflect the arrogance of the character. I don't know. I think the character wouldn't go that far. I think this is mainly so you can see Matt Smith's face, the actor. In terms of what's on their helmet, all right, we see like a dragon with wings. Now, I think the wings actually flap around a bit in the episode, which indicate it's not metal, and so they miss there. But it is not uncommon to have adornment on top of the helmet. In fact, the adornment, or something fancy on top of the helmet, is called the crest, because it's on the crest of the helmet. This also is adapted into heraldry, because in heraldry you would have your shield and the device or sigil on the shield, but then on top of the shield you usually have a helmet, and then on top of that helmet you would have something that reflects the device or symbology of the coat of arms itself, and you'd have the crest on top of that. And so when you say what is a knight's crest, it is usually the thing that they put on top of their helmet. So this knight's crest is the dragon. It's a dragon helmet. And we see another example of a crest on top of a helmet, which we don't often see even in medieval, like actual medieval period films. Not films made in the medieval period, they didn't have the technology, films that are based in the medieval period. Even in jousts, we rarely see proper crests on helmets, yet we see it here, which is brilliant. And so we see the other knights arrayed here. The armor generally just looks really, really good. They're usually wearing a jupon over top, or maybe a tabard or some type. But this is authentic. In the medieval period, yeah, they loved wearing certain, sometimes full brocade kind of outer garments on top of their metal to make them stand out, so they could see their colors or their, sigil device, whatever, so you could identify which knight was which. And we see it here. I love it. We see the back of Matt Smith's armor here. I forget the name of the character. But again, we see how low that breastplate goes, and then there's these weird kind of scale bits hanging out from underneath it. It's an awkward design, and doesn't look good. Check it out. This is another crest on top of a helmet. This, the family name of this knight was Hightower, and so clearly a tower, a fortified kind of castle tower, is there both the device, see the device on his jupon thing, and then we see a tower on top of his helmet, the crest of his helmet. Love it. This is brilliant. So in this scene, Matt Smith's character specifically strikes at the horse, and people might question, is this legal? It depends on the joust. And by context, because no one complains about it, it must be allowed. then the question is, why isn't everyone doing it? Well, if you win a joust, you usually win the opponent's horse. This is a more traditional element in the medieval period. Now, even though it doesn't come up here, the author, the creator of this world, George R. R. Martin, is aware of it because in one of the adaptations, The Hedge Knight, that is a particular plot point that you get to win because the jousting appears in it. I have the graphic novel. That's up there. It's really good. When you win the joust, it's a specific plot point that you win the knight's horse and usually armor as well. And so horses are worth a lot of money. The reason why not everyone would strike at the horse, you don't want to kill the horse, you want to win the horse. The other thing is, not necessarily the best thing either, because it could leave you vulnerable. I'm not experienced enough in jousting to determine that, but I could certainly intuit that there could be a number of reasons why you might not necessarily want to strike at the horse. There's a good chance that it could get stuck in the horse. You might not get a point. That could be the other thing. It might be legal in terms of the joust, but you might not win a point. If you get points for broken lances, there's the other element to it. So there's a lot of contexts that can explain why it's permissible to strike at a horse, but not necessarily the first option. And as a result, I don't have too much of an issue with it, except the execution, because the way they show it, it's just like he's tripping the horse, and it barely even hits the horse strong at all. It almost slides past the horse, and as a result, it just didn't come off like a big solid hit that would cause the horse to trip, as it shows it doing in the episode. And then he crashes to the ground pretty heavily. So this actually took the wrong screenshot, because what I found interesting here, oh no, we do see the helmet. See the helmet? It's this upper portion right here. The helmet is flying off of the knight as he's falling, and we even see that there's a strap there. So the strap must have broken or come loose, which is horribly unlucky, because that strap should have remained there and protected his face, because we also see this knight get horribly injured on his face as it ground into the dirt. If his helmet just stayed on, he would have been mostly fine as a result. So it's interesting, like, is it an accurate element? They are showing the strap there, but profoundly unlucky that it just manages to fly free in this moment. Another close-up of his armor, but in this one specifically, see how ill-fitted his helmet is. Do you see how much gap there is between his brow and the top of the helmet? That is all like vulnerable area you're opening up, making it easier for someone to strike in that opening. You want the helmet to cover as much as possible, and in this one, it's kind of like a very fantasy interpretation of a barbute helmet. Barbute. Actual historical barbutes are, if you see, much more enclosed. They have an opening down the model, and just enough for the eyes here. This is a much more open-faced one, almost to the point you could maybe argue it's a closer-fitting bassinet. So a bassinet usually is fairly fully open at the face, but it still comes down closer on the brow to protect the brow, where this is sitting much higher than it really should, which, one, leaves the face more open, and as a result, it also makes it look unfitted. The back of one of the other knights, and the armor, it looks brilliant. Looks really, really good. It looks to be a visored bassinet helmet by the thing. Now, a fight breaks out. Again, is this inaccurate to the medieval period? It depends on the rules. There are many types of jousts that did allow a melee after. Sometimes jousts had dedicated melees where everyone just was like a free-for-all, go in and fight, last man standing, win. Some of the jousts did allow for a fight, a duel, after the tilting of the lances. And it depends what, like some, it was always a fight after, sometimes no fight at all. In this one, in the context of this, it seems like it's an option that one of the knights in the joust can challenge the opponent to a melee fight afterwards to have a higher chance of winning, maybe get back lost things. And from the context, I think I remember an announcer saying, so-and-so has accepted the melee challenge, or something like that. I forget the exact words, but that in context means it's an option that both knights need to either agree to, but this guy doesn't look like he's agreeing, he's getting pulled off. So maybe they, like, if he can get to the other knight before they get to the other end, they can force a melee to happen. And so, no, melees did happen as part of jousts. Not always, again, it varied, but there are cases of it happening, so this isn't out of the ordinary. And then fighting to the death, that depended. It depends on if the opponent is yielding. Now, killing someone after they yielded, that's when it would be like, oh, you just basically murdered the guy, and I could see far more consequences happening. In context of the violence that's breaking out here, right, in the quick shots that we see the knights just killing each other. We don't see anyone specifically yielding. We see guys going at it hardcore and getting in a lethal hit in an attempt to incapacitate their opponents, and usually them dying as a result. But that's actually more in line with certain interpretations of medieval tournaments and everything. It's a more violent rule set. They did exist though, and people did die. You know, there is the obvious thing, as I mentioned before. Talented knights are just killing themselves. You might want to save them for warfare and battle, but if no warfare and battle has happened and these knights are just chomping at the bit to get into some action, yeah, things could get pretty darn violent in these tournaments. Interesting what I noticed here in this still frame. The sword that the guy's holding, see how there's no crossguard? There's just like a wooden handle and then a blade. And don't get to see the full thing, but this actually looks to be the Morgan Cleaver. So there is a Bible which has a lot of illumination, which means artwork in it. It's called the Morgan Bible, I believe. And in one of the images, there is this depiction of a really strange looking falchion, and it's just in shorthand come to be referred to the Morgan falchion. Or Morgan Cleaver, actually. This almost looks like it's one of those right there. It's like, hey, that's a very kind of deep-cut medieval element to have in a fantasy thing. And the only thing that I will note about it, it looks like it's holding it backwards. You can see where the fuller line is, which is on the back edge, and you can see, looking close, the edge line, and it's facing him. And so it's actually holding it backwards. So, but still, it's really good. That looks to be a Morgan Cleaver. There we go. All right, yes, there is a flail. Look, I don't think flails are the best weapon. I think there's so many problems that makes me dislike them in terms of the chance of swinging back and hitting you, the less control you're able to maintain over it. I have a dedicated video on the flail. The thing is, though, the flail did exist. Okay, there's artwork confirming that, yes, the flail seems to have been a very real medieval weapon, but it's not common in artwork. If you have a look at all the weapons depicted in medieval art, the flail appears very rarely. And as a result, it's a very specialized or rare weapon that not many people used. And then in extension to that, I feel they're overrepresented in anything that is an adaptation of the medieval period. Something like a film that's based on the medieval period and the actual history, and also fantasy like this as well, because they are inflating in the casual mind that the flail is a far more common and even effective weapon than it really is. There are utilities to it. I mentioned this in my dedicated video on the flail. One, perhaps if you're fighting someone with a shield, you can swing over the shield, and because it's on a flexible chain link, the actual striking end, instead, like with a sword, it will just stop when you hit the rim of the shield, but with a flail, it'll curve over and still has a chance to hit it. This guy is fighting someone with a shield, and so it's not a terrible pick in that regard. He's also fighting someone in armor, and so this is a more dedicated blunt force weapon that can do damage through armor. It's good as well. And it also has more chances of damaging a shield. In the context of this fight, we actually see this flail break apart Matt Smith's character's shield, and so for most contexts, this isn't a terrible pick. I still don't like it. I think a mace probably would have served him better for its uses. We see him try and use the flail, like it wraps around Matt Smith's sword at one point. That shouldn't be too much of an issue, because it's metal. It's not like it's going to grip. If the character just let go of the blade at one end and then let it slide out, it's not going to restrict the weapon too much. That's kind of, they're trying to go out of their way to make something more unreasonable happen for the sake of the dynamic fight scene. One thing I love here, though, is Matt Smith's sword. Matt Smith is the actor, is not the character. Is it Damon? Damon, I think is his name, the character's name. But I love this sword. Beautiful looking long sword. It's supposed to be Valyrian steel, I believe, as well. And we get a good close-up here. Look at that sword. Gorgeous. Like chef's kiss gorgeous. Very authentic looking medieval sword. Love it. If only his armor was like that as well. Another close-up of his armor. Again, look how long down this breastplate goes. There's no fold at all, and it just moves to these weird front tassets. Look, I don't like it. I like that the character here goes for a dagger. He hasn't yielded yet. He's been knocked off his feet. He's close, and so having a dagger as a backup weapon, one, yes, but that works because the dagger is a very effective weapon against armor. The dagger was used a lot as an anti-armor weapon because you can direct the point and get in between gaps a lot easier. And so sometimes, even often from what we can determine, a lot of fights get to the point where instead of just trying to hit through the armor with the sword, sword. It would be the preference if you can, but you're also grappling, trying to knock the opponent off their feet to pin them, and once they're pinned, you'd let go of the sword and grab the knife out, and then you can get them through the eye slit or something like that, or force them to yield. The character hasn't yielded yet, but he forces him to yield. But in this scene, we see some really interesting weapons just on the display here. It looks to be two different types of falchion designs. Look at, like, those are two different falchion designs. That's awesome to see. Different axes, almost like a Dane axe and then a battle axe, a sword. It's almost like a Bector Corbin or a war pick. Could be a pole hammer and then just a regular. So there's some really authentic weapons here. Behind it, we see halberds on display. Great weapons. And you don't often see medieval authentic falchions in medieval period films, let alone fantasy medieval films, and we do here. Love it. Love the king's sword in this scene, okay? I was told that this is Blackfire. It's a Valyrian steel sword. One of the things that I love about this, see how it has that kind of this like curving down thing with it's almost like a spiky curve? That looks to be a rain guard, a stylized ornamental looking rain guard, but it's not there just for ornaments. So a rain guard is a part of a sword, so you have the sword hilt, and sometimes there was these side parts that came over the blade, just as we see here, and when the sword goes into the sheath, the rain guards would go over the sheath on either side. So the blade would go in the sheath and the rain guard would sit over top, and it does exactly what the name implies. A rain guard. It's to prevent water, rain, from getting into the sheath and potentially damaging the blade. I'm not sure if the blade would be vulnerable to rusting because it's, you know, a Valyrian steel blade. But even if not, that looks to be a stylized rain guard, and I love the rest of the design of this sword as well. It's gorgeous. We get another close-up of the kind of Kingsguard armor, that kind of odd design. I've already mentioned that I don't like how it doesn't match the pauldrons, but when we see the helmet, I'm not a fan of the helmet either. I know they're trying to go for like a barbute, but it looks almost sci-fi fantasy with the lines and or elven. It doesn't fit with the strongly kind of medieval themed elements in lots of the other armor. You could say it's for, like the king's armor is supposed to be more fantasy, more regal looking. If they did that, maybe it kind of matches the breastplate, this helmet does, but not the pauldrons. If they just had, I don't know, some lines or things to try and match it, it would look like they would match together, so therefore it would look all right, but still not a fan of how it's a bit too sci-fi. I think there are fantasy designs you could do that just look a bit more grounded for this grounded world that Game of Thrones is based in, House of Dragons is based in. And there we go. These are the main things that I wanted to comment on in regards to a surprising amount of medieval authentic elements in House of the Dragon Episode 1. Perhaps we'll see even more as the TV show continues, and I wanted to share them with you and also share some of the things that are not accurate, which people might, you know, misinterpret to be, because this is a medieval themed world. Really interesting. Quite pleased with episode 1 so far. Not sure how the other episodes will go. We'll find out. But just in regards to the budget, the depiction, the armor, weapons, pleasantly surprised. Think it's really, really great. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed, and of course I hope to see you here on the next video on Shadowversity. So until that time, farewell.